Now, contrary to some practice and some teaching, the confusion induction doesn't consist of simply talking in confusing ways. Okay? You must talk in a way that builds response potential that can then be tapped into. Okay? And let me give you one simple example of that. And I'll just tell you what I'm going to do. Even though you know it's going to happen, it's still going to work. What I'm going to do is I'm going to demand some responses from you, and I'm going to frustrate them. And then I'm going to give you a place to put that frustration. And that's the structure of the confusion induction. Okay, so let's just start. I wonder if you're finding that this is relevant for you. And if on your way here this morning you found that the traffic was very heavy, if you think back to that and consider whether this afternoon you're going to enjoy the fact that when you look back on lunch it will have been a satisfying meal. Could you think about the fact that your family isn't here today but might benefit from this, but it isn't necessary to think about any of that because you can just relax? Okay. Now, so I gave you some indirect statements that sort of asked you to do something but kept you from doing it, so you wanted to do it, right? And then you had no place to put that, and then I gave you a place to put it. I said, but you can relax. Now that's a confusion induction. Confusion induction isn't talking mumbo-jumbo. But a confusion induction can use sound-alikes. You heard me playing with left and right in the first induction. It's your perfect right to know what hand is left, and the right one could become numb, but it doesn't matter because all the remaining sensation in the other one is your perfect right to experience, and you can relax. Okay, so, again, what do you respond to? And then I give you a straight communication that you can respond. So that's a confusion induction. I mentioned before that trance is a naturalistic experience. Let's just try this. If you would, let's just think about driving for a moment. Think about driving here this morning. And you might have been preoccupied thinking about things or listening to the radio. See, when you first learned to drive, you drove primarily with your conscious mind. You remember that? And when you drive with your conscious mind, you remember you couldn't listen to the radio because it was too much to keep track of? The rear view mirror and the steering and the foot pedals and passenger, and you couldn't put the radio on. Even now, when you use your conscious mind to drive, say you're looking for an address at night, how many of you find you put the radio down to look at the address better? Right? Crazy, but it works because there's too much consciously. So you learn to drive unconsciously. It's a pleasant experience. Sitting in a movie. You've had the experience of sitting in a movie and having your concentration fixed on the movie, and your peripheral vision kind of shrinks, and you don't hear the sound of popcorn being chewed, and you're really involved with the movie. Or standing in line for a movie and waiting for the line to move interminably. And when you get bored doing that, maybe you go off into some sort of fantasy, or thinking about the movie, or thinking about the person in front of you is moving awfully slowly. Or at night when you're lying in bed and you're awaiting sleep, and you get to that place where you're less aware of your surroundings and more aware of your internal state, and kind of forget about your body, and you've had that experience. Or perhaps concentrating on a manual task, sewing, reading on an airplane is a good one. If you're really concentrating on your book, the sounds of the airplane disappear. Watching television. All right, now what's happening to you? Anybody?
Going inside.
Going inside. Relaxing some, shoulders dropping, I notice, heads nodding. Okay. Now, all I'm doing, of course, is reminding you of naturalistic states in which you're already in that state. For the inexperienced subject, or perhaps even better, the frightful subject, the subject who doesn't really trust this process, one of the ways to proceed is to simply remind them of their innate capacity to go into those states. We all go into those states. The evidence is that every 60 to 90 minutes, if you don't daydream, you go a little nuts. Erickson also started the notion of directing suggestion to the underlying dynamic as opposed to simply symptom removal. One of the reasons that Freud abandoned hypnosis was that the symptoms came back. These symptoms, or a substitute symptom, would come back because he was in the business of suggesting away symptoms. At the count of 3, your headaches are gone. At the count of 3, your sight is restored. At the count of 3, whatever. Without regard to the functionality of the symptom. And from my point of view, the symptom can be functional intrapsychically, it can be functional interpersonally as well. So we need to look at the context in which the symptom occurs. All right, this is not new to you. It was new to Freud. So he abandoned hypnosis largely for that reason, and also the history tells us he wasn't very good at it. Things would be very different now if he hadn't abandoned hypnosis, I think. So Erickson taught us that we needed to direct the suggestion to the underlying dynamic. Now, I brought a transcription that I'd like to read you. This is a 43-year-old woman at the time of this intervention who is about, I don't recall, but 60 to 80 pounds overweight. She worked as a nurse. She had divorced at the age of 22, having been married for 2 or 3 years, and gave up on men. It was a very bitter divorce and a rotten marriage, and had not dated since then, in basically the 20 years since then. And suggested that she needed to lose weight for self-esteem. I asked her about her social life. She said, well, I don't really want to do that. I'm not interested in that. But it was a very incongruent response. You could almost hear the sadness in her and the loneliness in her. And she was a very lonely, sad woman. A very accomplished professional, but that was all that was cooking in her life, so to speak. And she ate. She worked and she ate. So I was taught initially, when you do hypnotherapy for weight loss, you do things like you say, you're going to put your fork down between bites, and you're going to feel full feelings faster, and you're going to eat slower, and you're going to not think of food, and you're going to distract yourself away. And sometimes that works. But of course, those are directing the suggestion to the symptom, not to what might be an underlying dynamic. One of the techniques I want to teach you is how one way to get to the underlying dynamic is have people talk about their symptoms without using words that reference their symptoms. All right, so let me give you this transcription. So here's this 43-year-old woman who claims that her problem has nothing to do with being lonely. Therapist. I want you to tell me about the feeling you get in your body when you're hungry. Well, I'm just aware of a gnawing feeling of hunger. Okay, don't use the word hunger. Okay, a gnawing feeling in my stomach, the lower part of my abdomen. It sort of goes across like a feeling that it needs to be filled up with something warm and soothing and good tasting. And I tried to eat when I feel that way, to do something else that would take away that feeling, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. The therapist, don't use the word eat, don't use the word hunger, and don't use the word food. Client, well, it's a gnawing void in my lower abdomen. It's a feeling that, well, it's an emptiness, something that, requires being filled up. A therapist, filled up? Completed. I need to do something right away that would make me feel better. And so I've used things that in the past have done that, at least temporarily. Things that look good, that taste good, that smell good, things that are pleasant. Therapist, feel good? Client, Now at this point, this is on tape, so I play the tape back and have her listen to it, and then we proceed. I say, what I want you to do now is make up a fantasy about what you just heard, as if that person on the tape recording is not you, and we're talking about that person, colleague to colleague. Tell me about that person. Client, long pause. And she's beginning to tear at this point. The person sounds quite sad, depressed. Sounds like she's been looking more within herself than to outside people. Either possibly she's been disappointed in people that she relied on before, or they haven't been available, like food is available. And I said, don't use the word food. And I say, other impressions. Well, she sounds pretty unhappy. I say, I say, if you were asked to give her some advice, what kind of advice would you give her? Client, I don't know. So I say, okay, well, you've heard her describe some symptoms she's having, and I want you to, again, dissociate yourself from her and make up a fantasy about what's happening with her that has nothing to do with her being overweight and nothing to do with eating, but given the same symptoms you just described. Client, she sounds like a person that maybe has been deprived in some ways that were pretty important, been disappointed, and has looked for things that were associated with pleasure, that were available, my emphasis, and has used those sort of as a substitute for what she really wants. it really sounds like she needs to change some things because things really sound pretty bad, and then nervous laughter. Then I say, what do you feel in your body right now? And what I'm noticing is she's sitting in the chair and she's moving her legs slightly, picking her knees up slightly. She says, well, it just sort of feels like my legs or my feet are twitching. And then she pauses and says, I think I need to do some moving around. I said, say that again. And she said, I need to do some moving around to relieve some of this because, I really feel sorry for that person, again, going into the dissociation. Okay, that's it. The therapy consisted only of talking about socialization, but indirectly talking about socialization so that she could hear it. At this point, if you were to say to the client, you know what I think you're lonely, use food as a substitute, she would have denied it. Okay. But to talk to her about putting her fork down between bites and all this would have not worked. So you see the underlying dynamic, a particularly graphic description of it, I think. Back to Erickson's contributions. He, I think more than anybody before him, began to point to hypnosis as a relationship that had both intrapsychic and interpersonal components. The relationship is the thing. Let me give you an example of that from clinical practice. This is the famous cheerleader case. Years ago, a cheerleader called me wanting to lose weight. A neighbor of hers had come to see me for weight loss, had been successful, and now she wanted to be successful. This was the summer between her junior and senior year of high school. In senior year, she was to be a cheerleader. Well, she had gained about 30 pounds over the previous year, and from snacking, as she put it, and wanted to lose this. Generally speaking, when you work with a 17-year-old person like that, when she had just, hadn't really taken good care of herself, you can generally do straight-ahead behavioral kinds of suggestions, and they generally will work. Whether they generalize or not is another story, but if you can get the weight off of them and they can keep it off, it's usually successful. So in her case, I tried to hypnotize her, and she defeated me at every turn. I did everything I knew how to do, and then some. I made a few up as we went. She would start to go, and then would pull herself back up and say, was I doing okay? They were doing fine. And then she would start to go, and she'd pull herself back up. So I think I'd rather try that chair. All right, try that chair. So she led me all around, and nothing was happening. So we were into this about 45 minutes, and I eventually did get a trance and an arm levitation, and the value of somebody's hand floating in the air is really nil, except that it becomes a convincer for them that this is an extraordinary experience because our hands don't normally float in the air unassisted, and so that's the purpose of it. Well, in her case, using a very metaphoric, indirect technique, I got her hand to float in the air without her knowing it. So we were getting somewhere, and she's talking to me and her hand's floating. And she catches it out of the corner of her eye, looks at it, slaps it down to her lap. I got angry and said, do you know what that means? That's exactly what I said. Now, what I was hoping she would say is, yes, it means that I'm being a terrible subject, you're a great hypnotist, and I'm very sorry, and I'll pay you double for the session. Well, she said nothing of the sort. Now, interestingly, she interpreted the question within the context of the trance, as opposed to the context of what I refer to as her resistance. Because what she said was, oh, and she put it back up again. Oh, does it mean I'm in some sort of trance? I said, well, of course. Now, she's anything but in a trance at this point. And I said, and do you know what that means? She said, no. I said, well, that means you'll follow each and every weight loss suggestion I give you, does it not? Yeah. So I gave her weight loss suggestions. Well, the primary weight loss suggestion I gave her had to do with her snacking, because she would eat reasonable meals, but she would pay out between meals. I said, and I borrowed this from Erickson, I said, on your way home, you'll go to a pharmacy, and you'll buy yourself a huge bottle of cod liver oil. You ever tasted cod liver oil? It's wonderful. And when you find yourself compelled to have snacks instead of reasonable nutrition or exercise, what you'll do instead is have a tablespoon or two of cod liver oil, and then you won't be hungry. Okay, sort of aversive pairing, right? Then I gave her instructions of self-hypnosis, told her how she could get back into it. She's listening, very much awake, to use the metaphor. And then I said, okay, now I want you to close your eyes because I'm going to awaken you. When I awaken, you're going to remember everything that I told you because I'm telling you to remember everything that I told you. It's important, and I'll talk about this in a few moments when I talk about the pre-induction talk, it's important to find out their expectations of hypnosis. Do they think they're going to forget everything? Do they think they're going to remember? She was one who thought that if she was really in a trance, she would forget. Okay, which normally doesn't happen, I might add. I'll add to that in a moment. So you'll remember everything because I told you you're going to remember everything. So she comes back out, I close your eyes, and then I counted her out. So that's it, that's the session, I'll see you in a couple of weeks. And she says, that's great, I remember everything, just like you said. Yeah, well. Okay, gave her an appointment for 2 weeks later. In 2 weeks, I'm standing in the doorway to my office. It's 10 minutes before her session. And she rushes into the door, bumps into me, goes into the office, sits down on the couch, noticeably thinner. And she said, I only had to use the damn cod liver oil twice, and I wouldn't have had to if you hadn't hypnotized me. So the relationship is the thing, right? I mean, there's no hypnosis there, whatever that is. It was the relationship that made this work. She received the suggestions, accepted the suggestions based upon the prestige of the relationship. She became an excellent subject. In fact, she became a subject that I used as a demonstration subject in a number of demonstrations. In the second interview, I utilized the fact of the first one. I said, you know, you were such a good subject that this time you'll find it even easier to go into a trance. Well, she had this conviction that it was going to work, and she did. She became an excellent subject and is very practiced even today, years later, as a self-hypnotic subject. So the relationship is the thing. There was no hypnosis. Do you understand what I'm saying, Jim? Hypnosis is contextually dependent. Too many writers, and especially the kind of other than Ericksonian writers, think of hypnosis and suggestibility and hypnotizability and susceptibility as innate, inherent traits of a person. Now, there is some truth to that some people who've naturally used association as a defense are going to be easier to work with. But it is contextually dependent. If I work with someone and I'm unsuccessful, they could go down the hall and work with someone else who has less experience even and do just fine, because the context is the relationship. There's a famous one of Erickson's where he was dealing with a doctor from South America, if I remember correctly, that Erickson was somewhat intimidated by and was actually a bit performance anxious with, as he describes the case. He went through all these machinations attempting to hypnotize this guy and just was unable to. Finally, as the guy was preparing to leave, where all the defenses are down now because the therapy's over, quote unquote, he finally said, well, listen, since we're just saying goodbye, and launched into an induction, and the guy went perfectly because his defenses were down. You also see the same kind of phenomena in the audiences of stage hypnotists, where the people on the panel up here may be just sitting there saying, forget it, but the people in the audience are thinking, what's going to happen to them? I don't have to defend it, and then they go, because it's them, right? That's the my friend John technique of Erickson's, where you take a target subject who is quote-unquote resistant, put him there, and take a trained subject and put them there, and tell that person to watch this person go into a trance, and then you begin to direct the suggestions to that person instead. And because they think you're talking to this person, they go. We had, a few years ago, an intern working in our clinic named Hadrian. And Hadrian, this was back when Mike Flowers and I were partners, and Hadrian had asked Mike and I to hypnotize him at various times, and we both tried and failed miserably. And it was the damnable thing, because Hadrian was so cooperative. He would say, well, you know, is this the way you want me to do it? And am I doing it right? But it would never work. We both tried, and then we tried together, and we tried differently, and we gave him homework, and it just didn't work. We thought Hadrian was the only person who only had one hemisphere, maybe. So we were doing a hypnosis workshop, and we were asking for demonstration subjects, and no one got up, and there was a pregnant pause, and Hadrian stands up. Says, I'll volunteer. So, quite without intent, I turned to Mike and I said, oh my God, audibly, so the audience could hear it. And Mike and I would cue off of each other pretty well, and so he said, yeah, I know what you mean. And then I got the thought, and apparently Mike did at the same time, that maybe this would be a strategy. So I said, oh, what are we going to do? And kind of in hushed tones, with the audience is listening, and Hadrian's listening. He said, I don't know what we're going to do. I said, I don't even know if Hadrian's capable of going into a trance. And Mike said, I don't think so either. We tried. And Hadrian's listening, and the audience is listening, and I finally turned to Hadrian and said, Hadrian, it's nice of you to volunteer, but I don't know that you can go into hypnosis. Now, consider the context. Here's Hadrian, a budding hypnotherapist, with all of his colleagues. We've already made the statement in the workshop that if you're going to be a hypnotherapist, you better be comfortable using trance with yourself. And it's already established as the culture. So what we're doing, in effect, is defining that if you can't do this, you're not okay, really. Well, everybody wants to be okay, of course. So Hadrian says, well, I really think I can go into a trance. And now we've got him. Now he's responding to us. So I turned to Mike and said, I don't think so. There's no evidence that we have that you're able to do it. Mike said, I've never seen evidence you could do it. I don't think you daydream. And Hadrian's insisting he can go into a trance. So we're building what? Response potential, right? Expectancy. And you can feel the audience going, wait, what's going to happen? I said, all right, if you think you can, prove it. We need proof. And you can see his eyes start to flutter. That's right, Hadrian, prove it. And prove it a little more with every step toward the stage and toward this empty chair. He turned out to be a very good demonstration subject for the interview. So again, hypnotizability, susceptibility is contextually dependent. I actually think that working with groups is easier than working with a single individual, because you can get all that leverage going. You know, that becomes the norm, and everybody wants to be normal. And so you want to follow along with what's happening. Even stage hypnotists, if you're up on the stage and you're the only one of 12 people who hasn't lost your belly button, you're the one who sticks out. You know, and we don't want to stick out in that way, like something's wrong with it. And the stage hypnotist is very good at framing that as there's something wrong with you. So it's contextually dependent. Now, there was a famous study a little while ago, it seems to me 2-3 years ago, where they wanted to prove that this so-called inherent or innate quality of susceptibility was in fact changeable. So they did tests on Antarctic scientists. Prior to going to the Antarctic for, I think, 9 months was the term of duty, and then after the term of duty. And found that the relative isolation up there and the necessity to sort of turn inward because there's nothing going on outside did tend significantly to increase their susceptibility as measured on normal scales. So there is evidence that you can train people. Let me talk a little bit about the methodological errors of measuring hypnotizability and the way it's done, at least. If I was going to measure your hypnotizability according to the standard scales that exist, there's two famous ones, the Stanford scale and the Harvard scale. And basically what the Stanford and Harvard scale are verbatim inductions and then verbatim utilizations. Utilization being what you do with someone once they're in the trance. So what I would do is I would take my piece of paper out and I would say, okay, now you're sleepy, heavy, drowsy, and your arm's getting heavy, and now in this and that and the other, and now you can't open your eyes, and then I'd note, okay, you opened your eyes, and you didn't open your eyes, and okay, and then now you can't lift your arm, okay, you didn't, and you did, and now you can't say your name, and you did, and you did, and then I'd tally it up, and then those of you with higher points were more hypnotizable, and those with lower points were less hypnotizable. Those of you who responded not at all, we would say in this kind of research methodology, were not hypnotizable. It's sort of self-serving, it seems to me. But then we would take you all and use you as controls in other experiments where you're supposedly not hypnotizable. Well, by definition, you're not hypnotizable. It's kind of a crazy thing. Because if you were to take that group of controls, put them in a room with experienced hypnotherapists, you'd probably have the same bell-shaped curve that you would with any slice of the population. It leaves out important variables. The personality of the operator, which is not neutral. The induction itself, it's very self-serving. So beware of this notion that hypnotizability is innate. Some people are going to be hard to work with, there's no doubt. But I don't think it's because that they have more or less hypnotizability. I think you have to consider, when we get into the assessment schema, you have to consider family of origin characteristics, styles of cognition, styles of representing reality. If you do that and you adapt the induction to them, I think everybody's hypnotizable because everybody goes in and out of trances. Erickson also was one of the early people, by the way, to experiment with conjoint family work. Not many people understand this, but he was doing this in the early 50s. Quite before the family therapy movement, or at least at its inception, but quite apart from the early pioneers, from Don Jackson and people like that. He was doing conjoint work early on. Also, he was using hypnosis conjointly. that is with members of a family in presence of other members of a family. And this was an early contribution that he carried all through his work. And some of my interest is in the area of this conjoint hypnosis. I think that Erickson's real genius, though, was his ability to describe experience. He could describe everyday psychosocial experience in words that we would understand, in words that we could all identify with almost as children. Do you know what I'm saying? That you simply had to identify with what he was doing. If he, for example, wanted to induce a hypnotic deafness, he wouldn't simply say at the count of 3 you can't hear. He'd begin to talk in a way that you might have to cock your ear to hear him. Okay? And so all of his output channels were congruent in terms of describing. It wasn't just his words, but his whole output described experience in very easy to understand terms. When he talked about a baby walking, he would talk about how the baby had to learn to shift its center of balance and how it learned to have to move the weight onto one foot so that the other foot could come forward, and things that we wouldn't normally think about. He could break down into those details. One of the principles for the hypnotherapist is that when you construct experience for your clients, there's exceptions to this, but you must construct it in terms that we can identify with in very primitive states. These aren't higher mental functions I'm talking about. I'm talking about, that reptilian brain being able to understand the descriptions of experience. And so you don't talk to someone in a trance in big words. You talk to them in smaller words. Let me talk just a little bit about state versus non-state. You've heard me say repeatedly that hypnosis is a relationship. It's something that happens between people. It's a special way that people communicate. That allows for this parallel processing or nonlinear processing mode. It's much better to think in terms of parallel structures instead of depth of trance. There are scales, the Husband and Davis scale and the Lacron-Bordeaux scale, which talk about depth of trance and say have scales. For example, the Davis and Husband goes from 0 to 30. And they say at depth number 6, we define that as light trance. And there it's possible to have catalepsy of the eyes, but at number 13 depth, it's possible to have medium trance where you can have partial amnesia. The implication being that you have to be at a certain depth for those things to happen. Well, that's not a useful way of thinking. I much prefer to think in terms of a dissociation model, that there are parallel structures going on, and that hypnotic phenomena are not depth-bound. Every hypnotic phenomenon that I'll be describing to you, you've all experienced in your waking state. Everybody's had hallucinations. How many of you have ever smelled the bacon before it started to cook, for example? Right? Or in the middle of the night driving down the freeway, convinced a deer ran across when in fact none did. We've all had those experiences. We don't require deep trance in order to be able to do that. So I want you to begin to think in terms of parallel processing structures. If you're aware at all of Hilgard's hidden observer work, they were experimenting with ischemic pain. Ischemic pain was pain that they produced by having a person immerse their arm in ice water. You close the blood vessels down. And it hurts bad. And they would put a person in a trance. The person would put their arm in the ice water, and they would tell them their arm was numb. They had no sensation. Then with the other hand, with automatic writing, they would have a hidden observer, so-called, write what the actual experience was. And they would write things like it hurts like hell, even though the person would report verbally that it didn't hurt at all. Okay. Well, this isn't a matter of depth. It's a matter of parallel structures. As opposed to having to go down to get to it, it's available to you now. There's a hidden observer in each of us right now watching, for example, that we don't need to go into deep trance to get to. The reason I want you to get off the idea of depth is that, especially neophyte operators, end up thinking that more is better, that deeper is better. And that's not necessarily true. Most therapeutic hypnosis occurs in what they used to call medium to light stages of trance. This deep trance phenomena, the somnambulism, is rather rare in clinical practice, actually. The person will select the depth of trance that is appropriate for the work to be done. Let's talk about assessment for developing an induction strategy. When I was first taught hypnosis, by the way, one of the first courses I took was at the medical school at the University of Washington, and we were taught memorize a single induction and use that induction regardless, and don't vary from it, and you'll be a good hypnotherapist.
you need to assess a number of factors in order to design an induction around that specific person with their specific needs and motivations and learnings and character traits and cognitive style and etc. What I did was I pulled this out of my intuitive experience. I must tell you that I don't always take out each of these items that I'm about to tell you and check them off with each individual person. But I must tell you that initially I did. So it's okay to do that. Just like it's okay to take scripts out initially and use them until you're comfortable and have some pattern that you can call on. It really is okay. And not many people understand this, but Erickson used to do that. He didn't write about it, of course. He would write an induction, maybe 20 different drafts, and he would go to the mirror and rehearse the induction 20, 50, or 100 times until he had it down. And that's how he started, and he did that well into his career. So it's okay to do that. You know, it's easy for me to stand up here and make things up as I go along because I've got 15 years of experience and I can pull out pieces of other inductions. You want to cue off the experience of the subject. I'll tell you an interesting example of that. One of the consequences of doing hypnosis from a script and not being in one sensory experience, I was working with a man who had an asthma-like condition and that was unresponsive to medical intervention. So my approach with him was to use idiomotor signaling. I was taking him back through the years of his life, asking him where the difficulty started. And he was to lift a finger at the year that it started. I have the script in front of me about how to do that. I'm doing the induction, and I'm watching his finger. So I'm watching this and this. And we go back through the years of his life. I think he was 43, and we go all the way back down to 1, 0, nothing. Back up to 43, nothing. Back down to 0, nothing. I thought, oh, what? Obviously I had to start at some time. Something possessed me at 4 to look up instead of just looking at his finger, and he was grimacing. I would say 5, and he was very serene. I'd say 4, and he would do this, and 3, and he would do this, and 4, and he would do this, and he'd been doing it all along, and I hadn't noticed it. And someone had thrown some carbon tetrachloride in his face at that age, and that and some other things that compounded it finally produced this asthma-like condition. That was the beginning of the end of the condition. But the point is, I wasn't in my sensory experience. So use scripts, but shuttle back and forth between what's actually happening and what's happening with the script. So these are the kinds of factors I found that I've intuitively relied on, and in years past when I've taught this, I found people have told me these are useful factors to keep in mind. The first one is the set and setting. Because what is the mental set and what is the setting? Let's take those separately. Under mental set, we're interested in what the client's motivation is. And let me just give you a vignette about that I think is rather humorous. I have an intake form where people write what they want to accomplish. And numerous examples of people who came in for weight loss who will write, I want to find out why I'm overweight, which is very different than wanting to lose weight. And you really need to take those kinds of things into account literally. I remember after studying with Frank Farrelly, do you all know Frank Farrelly, the provocative therapist? This was shortly after I first met Frank, and I was being provocative, and this woman came in for weight loss therapy. And so instead of doing hypnosis like she requested, I provoked the hell out of her and really got her mad. And she left that session, called back and canceled her second session, saying, I don't want to come back, and besides, I know what I have to do now. I thought, great, one session cure. So I took the case to Erickson and reported it to him, beaming, thinking that he'd think it was really neat. And he said, well, I hope you asked her if she was going to do it. Which is a very good point. So consider the motivation. You understand the difference. She said, I know what I have to do, but so do we, right? You know, the question is, will she do it? So there was a question, I should say, that the motivation hadn't changed, that she still wasn't going to do what she knew she had to do. She may have known it better. So consider the motivation. Now, the setting is important too. Is this an emergency room? Is this in a workshop? Like remember the case of Hadrian, where the setting made a whole big difference because it was in front of his colleagues, and he didn't want to be basically shamed in front of his colleagues. So those are important factors to take into account initially. Now, I want to talk about some diagnostic features of that individual, or of that family system for that matter, given that the individual presents many times on behalf of the family system. And I'm going to talk about these fairly intrapsychically, though, and let's take a look at those. It's important to know how the person pays attention. And this is on two different scales. That is their attention primarily focused internally or externally? Now, of course, this has implications for the induction. If a person's attention is primarily focused internally, then you probably don't want to start with an external focus with that kind of person. The external people are the people who notice things in your office. On the outside. Internal people are oblivious to your office. They will, 6 months into the therapy, ask you if you got new lamps. Also, as people get better, so to speak, they also tend to notice your office a little bit more. And I've noticed, especially in the people that I see who are so internal and so pulled back, that when they start feeling better, they start noticing the office, and inevitably they say, you got a new carpet, didn't you? No? Okay. So, yeah, now these are on continuums, obviously. Nobody's completely internal and nobody's completely external, but they may have a favored mode. Is their attention focused or diffuse? Now, this has implications for the induction, because if you do a very focused induction with a diffuse person, they'll have a hard time following you. They just don't want to stay in straight lines like maybe you do. They may want more of a kind of a mosaic sort of approach, if you know what I mean. Is their thinking linear, or I'll use the term again, mosaic? The implications for induction are obvious here. Let's look at two patterns of cognitive style. And the first one I'm going to refer to as a pattern of adaptation to external reality. And this is a continuum that ranges from introversion to extroversion. And I'm using those terms a little bit different, perhaps, than you've heard them. I'm thinking about this as how we adapt to our external reality. Well, let's take a look first at the extrovert, and then we'll take a look at the implications for induction style for that person. This is a person who has a bias of consciousness directed toward the external world. And you see, I'm using those terms a little bit differently than they've been used before in terms of interpersonal relationships. I'm talking more about cognitive styles. For the extrovert, the stimulus is the reality, as opposed to the internal reality. The outside stimulus is the reality. Extroverts are, generally speaking, not connected to internal states or to internal feelings. You can begin to hear, I think, the implications for induction. You wouldn't want to start out, most likely, with a person like this talking about a bunch of internal feeling states. You would want to start shuttling from the outside, maybe in visual terms or auditory terms, and move to the inside. The clinical issues for this kind of person, of course, have to do with reconnecting with inner life. Now, as contrast to the introvert is subjectively oriented to the inner world. They tend to be more abstracting. External objects are not the reality, but are only the trigger to internal realities. The meaning, the personal meaning of the external object is what's important, not the object itself. What it triggers inside of me. And of course, a lot of attention is given to dreams and internal feeling states. Well, then clearly, the clinical issues for this kind of person are dealing with the external world, dealing with the world of relationships. What this person will do with external objects that are difficult, they will tend to incorporate them internally and try and work it out internally instead of externally. Now, what are the hypnotic induction implications? An introvert is much more comfortable managing an inner world. They don't need a lot of guidance from you about that. Whereas the extrovert is uncomfortable managing an inner world. They need a lot more guidance from you and can be actually phobic of their inner world. With the introvert, you can actually interfere with their internal processes by painting pictures that are too complete for them because they want to provide the imagery. And if you give them too many directives about how to handle their inner world, then that will be interfering. They'll sort of say, well, I kind of went off on my own and did my own thing. You've heard subjects say that, perhaps. Okay. whereas the other folks need a lot of guidance. The imagery and internal states must be led to with great assistance offered. This is a very important distinction that I haven't heard many people talk about. And maybe it makes some sense of some experiences you've already had with clients and subjects. Now, what approximately correlates with this is another continuum that I think we need to look at least briefly. There's a cognitive style that I refer to as hysteric on one end of the spectrum to obsessional on the other end of the spectrum. And let's just take a look at the extreme ends of the spectrum and then talk about the implications for induction. The hysteric has difficulty in maintaining concentration or focus on one thing. So attention is diffuse, to go back to the earlier category. Directed attention is difficult. These are people who live in impressions. That is, they are impressionistic. Attention is global, diffuse, and lacking in intensity. They're easily distracted. We might think sort of stereotypically of a histrionic personality. These are folks who accumulate impressions as opposed to facts. Now, here it's clear where the engineer ends up. The engineer ends up on the obsessional end of it. And the artist ends up on the hysteric end of it. These are not judgmental terms, by the way. They're just descriptive. One of the ways to assess for this kind of style, and I know you'll identify with this when I tell you, this is a person who feels like they're cooperating and giving you data, but you really don't feel like you're getting anything. Have you had that experience? They can be overdramatic. There can be a fluidity of moods. There can be the bel indifference, the indifference to symptomatology. Okay, that's one end of the spectrum. Now, the obsessional end of the spectrum is almost the opposite. That is, attention is sharply, intensely, and rigidly focused. Memory is factual and technical. And there are people who don't see the forest for the trees. That is, it's hard to get a gestalt. There isn't a global concept. They're much more interested in facts than gestalts. You sit down at your word processor and 6 hours later you look up. I guess you know what I am. These are folks that have difficulty shifting attention. They're good concentrators because they're always concentrating. It's hard to pull back, hard to let things go. They require structure and time, whereas on the other end of the spectrum, those kinds of people sometimes sort of live outside of time. Affective experience is, and I'm talking again in extremes, but affective experience is seen as a distraction. This is the person who comes in your office and say, feelings? What do you mean, feelings? You've got to get on with life and nose to the grindstone. These people have over-adapted in this direction. They've forgotten how to be children, to just experience. They lack playfulness. If you begin to introduce, just as one concern for induction, if you begin to introduce playfulness in your induction, you lose them right away. This is serious business. They're interested in sameness and predictability. And of course, in the extreme, these are folks who may have obsessive-compulsive kinds of behaviors and thoughts. Now, for this kind of person, you need to direct their attention. You need to help them shift their attention. And they need to be assured that they'll have more control from the experience. It isn't so important for the people on the other end of the spectrum because control isn't necessarily a feature they value. But on this end of the spectrum, it is a feature that they value. Now, one of the other outcomes of this is that confusion techniques work well with this kind of person because they're trying to follow everything. And you can't follow everything in a confusion induction. For example, listen to each word, follow it, but know that as you listen to it, that every word has multiple meanings. And as you listen to every word, begin to listen for the multiple meanings. How to keep an obsessional person busy for an afternoon. My best friend, an attorney, is one of these people. And forever, I tried to induce him. Before I realized this in him, there was 2 inductions I did with him that eventually worked. One was this one I just told you, listen to each word as though trying to memorize it, listen for the multiple meanings. The other one was, and this is one you may use also with people who have a tendency to sort of sub-vocalize or auto-suggest. Okay, you want to tie up that internal voice so it doesn't counter-suggest to what you're doing. He's an attorney, of course he's auditory, right? The induction was, as I speak with you, I want you to follow along and repeat these words internally as I say them aloud. When you find that you can no longer repeat them internally, you will be in a trance. Now, it's a double bind. Because if he's listening to them and following them, he's going to go into a trance. And if he feels like he can't follow them, he's in a trance. And that's what eventually got Steve. And then he's a wonderful, wonderful subject. Then we want to take a look at, and unfortunately this isn't talked about much, even though Erickson gave us the notion of hypnosis as a relationship, the relationship assessment or relationship features I've not seen written. Doesn't mean they aren't out there, because I haven't read everything. But I've not seen this talked about. What is that person's interpersonal stance with you? Are they one up, one down, complementary, symmetrical, taker versus giver? Someone who's a giver, for example, you may want to have help you. Someone who's a taker, you may have to create the illusion, at least, that you're giving them something. Someone who's one up, it may be useful for you to take a one down with instead of a one up with. This was someone who was always one up, but also someone who responded to a challenge. And this is one more part of the assessment. You know, what are their hooks? And I'll come back to hooks in just a moment. But in this particular man's case, he was on the obsessive-compulsive end of the scale, a computer jockey. And not all computer jockeys are that way, but he certainly was. And he wanted hypnosis, but that was about the last thing he was going to let me do. So here's what I said, and this is right from the tape. Knowing that he would respond to a challenge, I said, I don't know if you can go into a trance or not. Perhaps you can, perhaps you have the intelligence to be able to do so. I really don't know. You have to say it straight-faced, of course. But there's a way we could find out. And what I'd like to find out is if you have the capacity to just do something I'm going to ask you to do. I don't know if you can or not. Let's just wonder together, how long do you think you'd be able to just sit there and just stare at your hand? How long could you maintain concentration enough, because he prided himself in his concentration, to be able to do so? He was already looking at this point. I didn't have to tell him to look at his hand. He was looking fiercely. And then I paused and said, and not need to move or talk. He's nodding. Or even have to close your eyes. Although you may wish to rest them and not need to strain to keep them open after a while, it's your business if you decide to keep them open or not. His eyes closed. And just forget about the rest of your body. Now, each suggestion, and he was there basically at that point, then a little bit of so-called deepening, but along the same kind of structure. Let's see if you'd be able to relax a little bit more. I don't know if you can relax more or not, if you have the concentration necessary to be able to do so, but let's find out together if you can. And if you can, just let me know. And he would nod, and he would go there. Now, the suggestions themselves, that is the therapeutic suggestions, were also done in a similar structure. I don't know if these will be helpful to you or not. You know far better than I do what's best for you, but perhaps something of what I say will be of value to you. Okay, so he had the sense of control, the sense that he was in charge, and I was taking a very one-down stance with him. So the interpersonal stance is very important. This case history will illustrate a number of different things, actually, but I also want to show you how one might deal with a one-up stance coming into the office. This is also a case history, though, that will illustrate what to do with magic seekers, people who are looking to hand away responsibility to you. This case was years ago, so pardon me if I read a little bit of it. A woman called me for an appointment for weight control, stating that she wasn't sure I'd want to see her because, in her words, she was hopelessly and grossly fat and had tried everything. So I consented to see her for an appointment about 6 weeks later. We had a fairly long waiting list. She came into the office, she walked in, and I said, and this was, in fact, this was during the days I was studying with Erickson, so it was, maybe you'll hear him in this. I said, well, you told me you were fat, but you didn't tell me you were sloppy. And she was. She was dressed horribly. Well, is it cold? I'll tell you what Erickson would have said about that. He would say she would believe you, because this was her self-image. In this woman's case, she seemed to light up when I said that. People who are overweight are told two things. You have a pretty face and nice hands. So she'd been told that, I'm sure, and no one ever tells them the truth. At this point, she smiled, she blushed, she fidgeted, but it was very clear that there was rapport, having said that. But she was a mess. I mean, her clothes were dirty, they were stained, her hair was uncombed, and you could just literally see the dirt in it. She was unkempt, she really was. I mean, she was a mess. She was 5'4", 260 pounds. Now, after I said this, she ran her fingers through her hair and said, it was the wind or something, words to that effect. Now, she explained that she had tried every means of weight control, and some had temporary success, but obviously none had worked. And that she was as fat as she'd ever been in her life. And here was and this is where you have to really listen between the lines, or listen specifically to key words. She said, now I want to try you. Okay. Well, hypnotists know that word try is a real charged word. Why? Because it implies two meanings. I might be able to do it and probably won't be able to do it. Right? Try not to think of a pink elephant. And what do you think of? You think of a pink elephant. If you don't want to think of a pink elephant, the suggestion should be think of an empty room. Okay. So I said, in the 6 weeks since you called me, how much weight have you lost? She says, oh, none. Sort of almost proudly. I said, none? She said, none. And I said, good grief, what are you waiting for? Which is a nice pun, by the way. The unconscious will hear those kinds of things literally. And if you ask, I know I'm being mosaic, but this is the other me, I guess. If you asked an overweight person to make a list of what it is in life that they're still waiting for and are still frustrated having not gotten, so that when they feel that frustration they're tempted to overeat, you may get a lot of important data. She said, I was waiting to see you. And I said, well, why now? You've been, and I used the word fat, for a long time. You know, people come in and we feel like we have to be therapists and be nice to them and, you know, say things like, well, you've been obese for a long time. She uses the word fat, I'll use the word fat. She said, well, I can finally afford you, referencing the fee. And I said, well, do you think hypnosis can help you? And she said kind of flatly, she says, oh, I don't know, maybe. I don't know if I can even be hypnotized. I don't know, maybe. Kind of like that. Well, not a lot of motivation. I said, well, what if you can't be hypnotized? Then what? She said, and she smiled. She was sitting down, she smiled, and she looked down at her stomach and put her hands on it like this and said, well, I guess I'd have to stay fat. Now, some people come in to hypnotherapists to prove to their social system that they can't be helped, so that people will get off their backs. I went to a hypnotist and I couldn't lose weight, and I sort of place her in that category. And I'm sure a lot of people have given her pressure about this. So I went into my, at least at this time of my life, mini Erickson, and I said, that's right, and as you sit there wondering, you may become aware of certain comfortable sensations developing in specific places in your body, breathing, and went on and did an induction, a fairly direct induction. I hypnotized her, got an arm catalepsy, her hand floating in the air, woke her up with her hand floating in the air, told her she wouldn't be able to lower it. She tries to lower it, she's unable to lower it. Then told her to close her eyes again, go back into deep hypnosis, and that over the next few weeks she would perhaps find her unconscious mind willing to want to help her. And then woke her up with the following suggestions. In a moment I will awaken you, and you will awaken feeling rested and refreshed. You will remember everything I told you, and in particular 2 thoughts will be on your mind. First, you will remember your hand in the air. And second, you will note that I've not given you a single weight loss suggestion. And I woke her. She woke with a broad grin and asked and said, "That's wonderful, that's incredible." She put her hand back in the air. "That's amazing how that happens. Let's get on with it. Make me lose weight. Make me lose weight." I smiled kindly, leaned forward, stared into her eyes and said, "Fine, I'll be happy to work with you as you lose weight, and I'll see you for your second appointment after you've lost 10 pounds. Now pay me and leave." She went back into a trance at that point, kind of shook herself back out and says, "You've got to be kidding." I said, "No, I'm not kidding. Our time's up. Let me know when you've lost 10 pounds. I'll be happy to see you." Now, this woman never came back, but her roommate was a colleague of mine and told me that over the course of the next year, this woman lost 80 pounds on her own. Now, if you're willing to work strategically, and I'm not willing as much anymore to work strategically, then you sometimes end up being the object of catharsis. They will do it to spite you, or they'll do it because they're angry at you. Erickson's real comfortable with that. A lot of people were real angry with him, but changed. I'm not as comfortable with that. That's a lot of wear and tear on the therapist, I think. But in this case, it worked. Okay, so that's several different things. You saw what I did with kind of this. She was one up by going one down, is what she did. Okay, sort of meta-complementary. And what I might do with a magic seeker. So what is that? What is their stance towards you? Is it one up? Is it one down? What about their affective style? Is the affect specific or general, consistent or sporadic, variable or restricted? And again, you want to attempt to pace that as best you can. If you're going to use stories that have a lot of emotional oomph to them, then it better be with a person who is comfortable with that. Otherwise, you will lose rapport with them. Is their emotion constricted? Is it variable? How do they express emotion? And therefore, how will you express emotion in your induction, in your utilization, in metaphors? The attempt is to pace them. But their language, what kinds of recursive words do they use, or phrases? Accents and dialects. Erickson was a master at adopting people's accents and dialects. I once did a demonstration with a consultee of mine and asked him to role play a case he was having difficulty with. It was a truck driver, rural dweller, who was a nice enough guy, but did not use very sophisticated language, and also had this kind of southern sort of drawl. So when my colleague was role-playing the subject, he was using this accent without even knowing it. So I started using the same kind of accent back and did the induction. Worked very well. I came out of the trance, this is in front of a group, and then we asked the group, "What did you see that you thought worked well?" One of the first comments was, "I thought you were adopting the accent. Worked very well." To which the subject, the colleague, said, "What accent?" You see, it was unconscious. It was out of awareness. And this is a couple who came in, who had been seeing me for a while, and in one session, the wife mentioned that she was dieting and how unfair it was to have to diet. It was unfair, and she kept using that word over and over and over again. Every time I tried to focus on the marital issues, she kept talking about how unfair it was. Well, she's saying something by saying that. So I turned to the husband, I said, "Do you have any idea what unfair, what might be unfair?" And he said, "Well, I have a hunch, but I'm not sure." I turned to the wife and, just going for broke, said, "Yes, a lot of things in life are unfair. Loss is unfair." At which point the wife started to cry, the husband started nodding his head, and it turned out that was the 5-year anniversary of the death of a child to SIDS. She didn't even know that consciously, but was experiencing the unfairness of it all, the unfairness of the loss. So those words are very important. So listen for recursive words. Geographical background is important, the situation and the background. If this person, for example, grew up underneath a freeway and was used to blocking out noises, they've developed some naturalistic capabilities that you can use in the trance induction. If, however, the person grew up in the country and was used to not having to block out noises, that's important to know. It's also important from the point of view of how they experience time. So how many people grew up in the country? Okay. Oh, great. And how many people grew up in the city? Okay. The people that grew up in the city, what is your experience of time? What is time like for you?
Important.
It's important. Okay. And how about the people who grew up in the country? Is it as important? It's not as important. Maybe things are done by seasons or phases of the moon or what have you. Right? If you get around to it. Exactly. People in the city wear digital watches. People in the country don't always wear digital watches. Don't even wear a watch. Right. So the experience of time is very different, and that will follow oneself through one's life. So if you're a city dweller working with a country person and you have to do everything now, it's real important to know that may not be pacing that person's experience of time. So I try and find out what their background is, rural or country. There's some other distinctions too. People who have had rural or country experience sort of have a different notion about life cycles than city dwellers. You know, if you grew up on a farm, you got to see life cycles in animals, for example, that city dwellers never had a chance to see. And that's an important, rich experience that city dwellers won't have. And my experience is that people who have witnessed that kind of thing are far more comfortable talking about it than those of us who didn't. Special situations in terms of their geography. Did they move a lot? If they moved a lot, chances are they didn't have a chance to make many extra familial linkages, like a military family or a diplomatic family. These are people who may, in fact, be, in a sense, more self-sufficient. Family characteristics are important. Certainly, the present family situation is important. If mother comes and picks up that 43-year-old after each session, that's important data. You may remember, I don't know if you read this case or not, but it was the case that I presented to the first Erickson Congress of the bedwetter, where I was working with him individualistically, but each session more and more of his family would show up in the waiting room, and they would look like there was major surgery going on. You know, poor little Johnny. And till I finally realized that my model for this was wrong, that what I really had to understand was the whole family was invested in this problem. The eventual intervention, by the way, was to give Johnny amnesia for his problem and bring the family together, saying we were going to have a contest of who could best act as though Johnny didn't have the problem, and at the end of 90 days there'd be an award. And that's what finally did it. Johnny was an excellent hypnotic subject and did all the right things, but continued to wet the bed. Because his two little sisters were born into this family drama of trying to cure Johnny. And so this was the primary family organizing principle. So when one after the other of them would show up in the waiting room, I would say, wasn't that nice? They care for him. And just continue to treat him intrapsychically until I finally realized it was the wrong model. So that's important data. Birth order, I think, is important. Now, you know, these studies have been proved and disproven and proved and disproven constantly, but there is something important. Was it in birth order? For example, the oldest child, if they were a parental child, will have a much different notion of responsibility, say, than the youngest child. And taking care of. That older child will be the one who you can enlist their care in order to help in the induction. Listen, I wonder if you'd help me by putting your hands in your lap, staring down at them, and this would be a great help to me if you could simply concentrate. Whereas the youngest one, perhaps, stereotypically, you might say, let's have some fun here. I've got a great idea. Okay? And obviously these are overgeneralizations, but what were the rules of the family? How were emotions handled in the family? Let's just say you have someone who was taught that feelings aren't okay. I know none of us were like that, but some people are taught this. And then you're working in a trance or even a trance utilization to try and enhance the experience of feeling. Well, you're bucking up against the family hypnosis then. You need to know that. Because what you may do if you don't know that family legacy is you may attribute it to your technique. And it probably isn't your technique. It's probably more about going up against the family rules. Some dysfunctional families have a rule that say that the reporting of pain is not okay. So these people will minimize the experience of their pain and certainly minimize reporting their pain. Well, you need to know that. If you're going after that somehow or another in your trance work and it's not coming, again, don't necessarily attribute it to technique. Ask yourself, what kind of family hypnotic rules and programming are we bucking? So how are differences handled in your family? Well, we never expressed them. Well, would you tell me if you didn't like what I was doing? Well, maybe not. It's important for me to know. They might just leave the therapy instead of reporting that they were just unhappy with me. How were negotiations handled in the family? Where were the coalitions in the family, the alliances in the family? How close to their families do they live? Are they practicing emotional cutoff, or are they enmeshed with their families? And I want to tell you something. You will never, ever, ever be more powerful than a family. The family hypnosis will defeat you inevitably if you go up against it. I've seen more than once, in fact numerous times, working with people where I think I've made progress, even after long-term therapy. They will go back to their families, and in the space of 30 minutes, all your work's erased. I do a number of things with that. Future pace it, talk about it in advance, what to anticipate. I also make a large use of what I refer to as transitional objects, where if someone's going to go visit their family with this new this new understanding, I'll have them pick, I have a bunch of little tchotchkes, you know the term? Knickknacks in my office, and I'll have them pick one that seems to represent them, and they borrow it and take it. So they put it in their pocket. And then when they're talking to the family, they touch the object and it reminds them of the differentiated part of themselves. So they remember the therapy, they access the therapy that way. It's an anchor. One other aspect of assessment is your own characteristics. Like it or not, we all have blind spots. It's important that you look at aspects of self that are convergent and divergent from that client. What do they remind you of in your own self? This is true, of course, for all kinds of therapy, not just hypnotherapy. Do you fear violence from that person? If you fear violence from that person, chances are you may be a little, at least unconsciously, afraid to have them lose control. So you may unconsciously be working, maybe consciously working to induce a trance and unconsciously working not to induce a trance because of your fear. Look at your own family of origin backgrounds. Was there an out-of-control parent, for example? Is this person reminding you of that parent? And if so, you're going to do everything you can to keep the lid on things. You understand what I'm saying? Lifestyle issues. What is their immediate situation? The case I want to tell you was the man with the nightmares. This man came in complaining of having horrendous nightmares, so bad he was afraid to go to sleep every night. He was a Boeing engineer, and this was in the late 70s, and he was making good money. He was making about $28,000 a year, which for them, even now, I suppose, isn't bad. And it was a man of means, so I knew that much about him. And he told me a few other things about the nightmares, but that, as far as I was concerned, was just content. What was important was he was having nightmares and didn't want them. So we did hypnosis. He was a good subject, and tried to take away his nightmares or diminish them. And they didn't go away. In fact, they got a little worse. Did this for a number of sessions, I think a handful of sessions, and he said, well, I don't think this is going to work. I don't think it's going to work either. And he took off. About 6 months later, I got a postcard from him saying, I just thought you'd be interested in the fact that I moved. I got a brand new condominium. Since the first night I moved into the condominium, I haven't had any nightmares. Thanks for your help anyway. And that disturbed me. So I looked back over the case notes, and I saw data that I had ignored. He lived in a $78 a month apartment. In my notes, what I found and had forgotten was that each and every time he had not slept there, a couple times he went camping, one time he slept at a woman's house, he had not had the nightmares. It was his unconscious holding him hostage, saying, basically, you want to live here? I'm going to make it tough on you. You don't need to live here. He was a man who had real issues about doing things for himself. It wasn't okay to buy things for himself. He had a ton of money in the bank and ratty clothes. Okay. So, and not that clothes are important, but, it's part of the pattern. So, this was an important assessment feature. The fact that he was living in a $78 a month apartment was very important to the case. I hadn't considered it. And then, of course, one would think the first place I went was, well, my technique didn't work. Well, it wasn't my technique at all. It was my paradigm for the case. And then I've had two or three, I think three, women that came to see me, these are wonderful cases, who lost their wedding rings and wanted hypnosis to find their wedding rings. If someone lost their wedding ring and wants help in finding it, assess the marriage. One of these three women wrote me after we were unsuccessful with hypnosis and finding her wedding ring and said, I want to tell you I found my wedding ring on the day that my husband and I went to marital therapy. I mean, there's symbolism to this. These are important things. So you understand what I'm getting at. These are important assessment features. The client's self-description of the problem. Listen carefully how they describe the problem. And be careful that you don't translate it into comfortable, familiar terms for you. Weight loss, XYZ. Okay? For example, the person who says, I want to find out why I'm overweight. Don't consider that a weight loss case. Consider that an experimental investigation. And what are their personality values? What are the hooks? What's important to them? Hard work, leisure time, nose to the grindstone, challenge, accomplishment. What are the hooks for them? So what will you use in your induction then to hook those values? If, for example, someone has a hard work ethic, then you want to incorporate that. Say, now we're really going to work hard today. And it may take us a few sessions of good hard work to perfect this, but I know you're comfortable with the idea. Now that would appeal to someone who doesn't believe that there's a free lunch, who may be skeptical of hypnosis because they associate it with magic and free lunches and not having to work for something. You want to disabuse them of that idea, especially if that's their value. Do you see what I'm saying? I worked with a 12-year-old boy once who was a fire setter. He lived in a group home, and the problem was the fires he set were in other people's beds. And this was intolerable, of course. So they sent him to me, and we had great rapport. And I worked with him hypnotherapeutically, and one of the things I sometimes do with acting out kids is find an internal advisor who will show them images of the future of how they'll be if they continue to do that. And they're very aversive for them generally. Well, I tried this strategy with him, and he was averse to it, but it didn't change his behavior. He continued to set fires in the bed. Now, part of the problem was he would come from the group home with a therapist. I would do the intervention, then staff would undo it. He'd go back feeling bad about himself, and they would say things like, well, you shouldn't feel bad about yourself. You're an okay kid. And that's true, of course, but it took away the power of the aversion, So, but one of his values was helping me. He really liked me. And so this is, again, back in my tricky days, but what we decided to do was the following. We rehearsed this in advance. The therapist who brought him was going to dismiss the kid from the room for this one particular session, because actually the fire setting had increased, and leave the kid in the waiting room for about 10 minutes, and then bring the kid back, and I was going to act like the therapist had chewed me out. I would turn and say things like, I'm really sorry, I thought I could do this case, and I'm very sorry that I can't, and I hope this won't interfere with our referral relationship because I really need the business. And he was listening to this, of course, saying, well, what's wrong? And, it's nothing you can do anything about. It's just, I'm in trouble because obviously I haven't been able to help you. What do you mean I can't help? Well, it would require you to stop setting fires. I know it's too much to ask. And, he stopped setting fires because he didn't want to see me lose my job. Now, I have some question about whether that becomes integrated or not. In his case, I suspect it did, and I wouldn't work that way anymore. What I might do is internalize that whole process in him, attempt to get him to act out all those parts internally instead of externally, because I don't believe in tricking people. I'm going to have you role play going through the pre-induction talk and dealing with people's misconceptions. Then I'm going to have you interview them to elicit this information. I'm going to have you do that now.